Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Nassim.
Great. First of all, congratulations on getting this report over the line. We've seen the response. How's the last week been for you?
I think it's been very gratifying to hear from so many civil society partners. Of course, Palestinians have been using the term apartheid to describe their lived reality for years, if not decades. And many others across the world, have used this term. So I think it's been, deeply gratifying to see so many people see, sort of another voice recognizing the reality for what it is. It's been wonderful also to see serious engagement by so many publications across the world reporting on this, but also sort of taking stock of the reality on the ground. And also to see governments. We've had many meetings with governments at different levels, parliamentarians and others, and really to see so few people challenge the facts, the merits, of the argument. It's almost as if everybody sort of knows what the reality is, and it's a matter of the recognition by organizations, individuals becoming loud enough they can't brush that aside. So it's been a chaotic week, between dealing with the coverage and engaging with governments. But at the same time, I think it's been significant to see, this analysis, which we believe is the correct one, gain widestream, I think, engagement and acceptance. And we're eager to sort of translate that now into improving the situation on the ground.
Yes, and we'll be discussing a lot about that. But before we dive into the report, let's just begin with Human Rights Watch itself and the thinking around the publication. For those who haven't read the report, the title is a threshold crossed: Israeli authorities and the crime of apartheid and persecution. So Human Rights Watch has been covering the Israeli-Palestinian issue for decades. When did it take the view that what it was documenting in Israel-Palestine was actually apartheid? Was it 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago? And then it started gathering evidence. When did it kind of pass its own threshold?
Absolutely. So let me sort of explain the process at Human Rights Watch. So Human Rights Watch has been documenting human rights abuses on the ground for years, over 30 years in Israel, Palestine, and discrimination has become an increasing focus of ours. So you could go back to 2001 when we wrote about discrimination in schools inside Israel for Palestinians, or 2008, our report on the unrecognized Palestinian Bedouin villages in the Negev, or 2010, we wrote a report, Separate and Unequal, 2016, Occupation Inc. I could go on and on and on. But what we started to do a few years ago is say, let's connect the dots. Instead of writing another report that looks at a facet of the situation on the ground, let's try and sort of more holistically look at the situation of Palestinians living under Israel's rule across Israel and the occupied territory. So the first thing we did, Nassim, is collect the facts. Me and my team on the ground did the research. We did case studies. We looked at years of trends and years of Human Rights Watch research. We looked at the work of Palestinian, Israeli, and other organizations, and we wrote a factual report that reached no legal conclusion. At the same time, our legal department, we asked them for, to help us with the guidelines for the law around particularly severe discrimination. So they sent us the law around severe discrimination. And of course, there is a prohibition on severe discriminatory oppression or apartheid. And while, of course, that's a term originally coined in relation to South Africa, international treaties make it a universal legal term. So they set out to us the guidelines for not only the prohibition on apartheid, but the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution and the elements of the crime. So once we received that guidance from our legal department, we then applied the law to the facts that we had documented. And we reached a tentative conclusion that apartheid and persecution had been carried out, but those conclusions went through our review process at Human Rights Watch. We have a very vigorous internal review process that involves consultation of many colleagues from our legal department, our program department, from different levels. And the report went through and was approved by our review process earlier this year. And then we prepared to translate the report and release it when we did on April 27th.
So let's dive into the report exactly. What does it say specifically? I mean, I was curious to find you don't really say Israel is an apartheid state, for example, which many people would use, a term which many people use. You'd say Israel is carrying out the crimes of apartheid and discrimination and whatnot. So why that distinction, and how is that really being manifested in the different parts of Israel, occupied territory, Gaza? So just lay out how that
Sure.
apartheid policies are being, played out in those regions.
So when many people speak of apartheid, they do it in a historic or a comparative way, right? So the term apartheid state is actually not a legal term, right? Apartheid is a crime against humanity, like other crimes against humanity, persecution, genocide, etc. So there's no such thing as an apartheid state as a legal matter any more than there is a torture state or a genocide state, right? There's a crime of apartheid. So what we did in this report is we looked at the elements of apartheid and persecution. So let me just explain what that is. Apartheid is a crime against humanity, involves particularly severe abuses or inhumane acts when carried out with an intent by one group to dominate another amid a context of systematic oppression. So intent to dominate, systematic oppression, inhumane acts, right? Persecution is very similar. It's about a discriminatory intent when it leads to severe abuses of fundamental rights. So what Human Rights Watch found, based on our research, is that the Israeli government has pursued a policy or an intent to maintain the domination of Jewish Israelis over Palestinians across Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. So across the areas where Israeli authorities exercise control, they have sought to maintain demographic and control of land. What that means is pursuing policies that ensure a Jewish demographic majority across Israel and the parts of the occupied Palestinian territory, and particularly the West Bank and East Jerusalem, that Israel hopes to rule over in perpetuity. In conjunction with that intent, with the demographics, there's been a land policy which seeks to maximize the land available for Jewish Israelis and confine Palestinians into dense enclaves. So in addition to that overarching intent, our finding of apartheid and persecution is then based on severe abuses carried out in the occupied Palestinian territory. And the report delves into how that manifests into severe abuses of fundamental rights, inhumane acts, as well as systematic oppression. So we focus on things like the imposition of draconian military rule on 2.7 million Palestinians in the West Bank, while Jewish Israeli settlers living in the same territory are governed under Israeli civil law. We look at the closure of Gaza, 2 million Palestinians, 2 million plus Palestinians, effectively caged into a 40 by 11 kilometer strip of land where they're robbed of their freedom of movement outside of exceptional humanitarian circumstances. We look at Israel's policy in East Jerusalem and the majority of the West Bank under its exclusive control, where it makes it effectively impossible for Palestinians to build, where it's carried out coercive policies, home demolitions that amount to policies of forcible transfer. We look at the suspension for 4.7 million Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip of their basic civil rights, the right to free expression, assembly, association, or any say over the government that rules over their lives. So based on that overarching intent to dominate across Israel and the occupied territory, which manifests itself in a two-tiered discriminatory system across areas of Israel's rule, in conjunction with the severe abuses in the occupied territory, led Human Rights Watch to find that Israeli authorities are carrying out the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution today.
And you, of course, cover abuse and discrimination within Israel proper itself. Of course, one of the things you highlight, of course, is the Israeli law passed 2 years ago, where it defines Israel as a Jewish state. So how important is that in passing the threshold of being an apartheid state when Israel installed a law saying that it is a Jewish state and has self-determination for Jews only?
Look, I mean, the first is to say that our unit of analysis Apartheid is a crime about domination by one group over the other. So it's quite clear when you're looking here that one primary government rules over the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. That's the Israeli government. In that area, you have about 6.8 million Jewish Israelis, 6.8 million Palestinians. Palestinians are systematically discriminated against at different degrees of intensity, while Jewish Israelis are privileged, methodically. Jewish Israelis live under one system of rules and laws with the same rights wherever they choose to live. Palestinians are discriminated against wherever they choose to live at different degrees of intensity as part of a strategy of fragmentation. So the situation of Palestinians inside Israel is certainly a part of the larger picture. The discrimination Palestinian citizens of Israel face reflects the intent to dominate, which is one of the three elements of the crime. And to that extent, the Jewish nation state law passed in 2018, while it did not dramatically change dynamics on the ground, by codifying as a constitutional principle the idea that one of the two groups living on the ground are entitled to certain rights that are denied to another, it is very powerful evidence of that intent to dominate, which is one of the elements of the analysis. Of course, apartheid also requires a high threshold of repression, and Human Rights Watch found that threshold of repression met in the treatment of Palestinians in the occupied territory. So the report presents a nuanced picture. We're not saying Israel is or isn't an apartheid state. That's not a legal determination. We didn't set out to say, we're not saying it's apartheid under every inch of territory. We're saying Israeli authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution based on that overarching intent and based on those severe abuses in the occupied territory.
I mean, one way this plays out is, of course, in East Jerusalem, and you have a number of infographics regarding East Jerusalem with the heading "Born Unequal." A Jew born in East Jerusalem, for example, is discriminated. A Palestinian born in East Jerusalem, is discriminated and has privileges which doesn't have privileges which Jews born in East Jerusalem have. So can you give us some examples of those privileges and discriminations within East Jerusalem under the heading of born unequal? You have a number of those infographics within the report, and I found it quite interesting in explaining and clarifying how it plays out for Palestinians and Jews within East Jerusalem.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think East Jerusalem is a great example of apartheid. Israel considers it part of its sovereign territory, in fact, its capital, but it's occupied territory under international law. And Palestinians in virtually every respect of life are methodically and systematically discriminated against. It starts with their legal status. Jewish Israelis living in Jerusalem are Israeli citizens. They can live their entire lives abroad and come back and retire in Jerusalem. Palestinians have a conditional revocable status. When Israel annexed East Jerusalem in 1967, it gave Palestinians living there, who in many cases go back years or decades or generations, the status of permanent resident, effectively the same status as a foreigner who moves into Israel. That status can be revoked and has been revoked thousands of times since the Israeli occupation began. It can be revoked, for example, if you move abroad, if you move to a different part of the West Bank, if you move to a different part, of the territory living under Israel's control. So fundamentally, the legal status of Palestinians and Jewish Israelis living in that same territory is different. Palestinians can apply for citizenship, but it's the majority don't apply because they consider themselves occupied population. And under international law, you should not have to become citizens of the occupying state to have your rights. And even those who apply, many are rejected. And beyond legal status, you see the discrimination permeate access to land. Palestinians in East Jerusalem effectively can't get a building permit. And so they're largely confined to about 15% of the land in East Jerusalem, which is already largely built up. So you'll see Palestinian areas densely populated, no room for growth, and people really struggling to live there. Meanwhile, Jewish Israeli settlements, which are illegal under international law, are sprawling across East Jerusalem, built on expropriated Palestinian land. About 1/3 of the land Palestinians own in East Jerusalem has been expropriated by Israeli authorities and given largely to settlers. In addition, you go to resources, right? And you see that Palestinians systematically, are discriminated against when it comes to allocation of resources. They make up near 40% of the population, receive about 10% of the municipalities, resources. And that manifests itself in access to basic services, electricity and water, and the list goes on. In the report, and I can say more about this, we take a case study of Kufr Aqab, which is a Palestinian area in East Jerusalem, where Israel in 2002, the Israeli government, when it built the separation barrier, built it to separate Kufr Aqab from the rest of East Jerusalem. So you have a Palestinian area that's part of the municipality that lies beyond the separation barrier. And the Israeli government, since building the barrier, has effectively stopped, policing these areas, giving building permits, providing more than basic services. And as a result, they've allowed the creation of an overcrowded slum. And one of the reasons why it's an overcrowded slum is it's one of the few areas where Palestinian West Bank ID holders can live legally with their spouse who is an East Jerusalem ID holder. So you have basically this rare area where mixed couples, mixed in the sense they have different legal statuses, where Palestinians who might live a few minutes apart can live together, and the government has effectively refused to serve. It's one of the many examples of the systematic oppression and discrimination that Palestinians face in East Jerusalem. Indeed, they're born and live unequally.
Yeah, I mean, the report is littered with examples. But if I was to push back a little bit and say, look, Israel gives Palestinian citizens of Israel are granted rights. They can vote. We may even see a Palestinian party going into coalition in the next government. So do these arguments matter? This as a constant refrain from pro-Israeli groups, but do these arguments matter in the whole bigger scheme of things when you make that determination that Israel is practicing apartheid?
I think it absolutely matters, right? I mean, the reality here is that the treatment of Palestinian citizens of Israel in comparison to Palestinians in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, certainly they have more rights. I think that's undeniable, right? The rights, citizenship movement, etc. But even inside Israel, they face stark discrimination on account of who they are. What do I mean by that? I mean that by law, they have a different in essence, citizenship structure, right? They get citizenship by virtue of proving that they family lived there at a certain time, whereas a Jewish citizen of another country can automatically become a citizen. Not just that, but Israel bifurcates citizenship and nationality. So there is a nationality of Jew and of Arab, and different baskets of rights go to
something we should say is very unique to Israel. I don't think you have that kind of setup in any other democracy where there is a bifurcation between a citizenship and a nationality. Yeah.
And in fact, I mean, there's been cases that have gone to the Israeli Supreme Court asking for there to be an Israeli nationality, and the court has rejected that. They classify folks based on different nationality. And it's not only that, there are hundreds of small Jewish towns littered across Israel that have the authority by law to bar Palestinians from living there. And there have been studies done of hundreds of these towns with no Palestinians living there. You have about Palestinian citizens of Israel make up 19% or so of the population. They largely live in Palestinian areas that have about 3% of the land of the entire country, and that systematically get discriminated against when it comes to resource allocation, right? So, I mean, we can go down the list, but to be clear, apartheid requires a high threshold, of repression, and Human Rights Watch found that repression met in the occupied territory. So we focus on the situation of Palestinian citizens of Israel to illustrate the intent to dominate. There's one government with one policy pursuing one intent, and that discrimination reflects that intent. But we found that the threshold of apartheid is met in the occupied territory.
I mean, one interesting thing, if viewers are interested, is to read upon the ownership of land itself within Israel. Non-Jews will not have access to something like 80% or more of the land within Israel. So I think that's an interesting case study to read and understand why that is important to, recognizing Israel as practicing apartheid. But turning away...
Just to sort of add to that, I mean, on this point, right, 93% of the land in Israel is state land, right?
Yeah.
And, that's significant, right? Because, the state, and there's been a study done by a government commission that basically said that the state uses that land for the purpose of Jewish settlement. This was a early 2000s Orr Commission report. So yeah, it's definitely reflects the deep discrimination Palestinian citizens of Israel face, which reflects that intent to dominate, one of the elements of the analysis.
Let's turn our attention slightly to the reaction. I always find the response or the lack of it quite revealing. But before we do that, I mean, tell us about your situation. In 2019, you were expelled from Jerusalem for basically doing your work. What's your situation with that now? And were the Israelis at the time aware that you were working on a report, or you may be working on a report that accused Israel of practicing apartheid? And how has that really impeded your ability to, or has it impeded your ability to work on this report?
Yeah, so we have no information the Israeli government was aware of that. At the time I was deported, we had not made a legal determination of apartheid. We were, still very much in the evidence collecting mode. But in terms of your larger question, Human Rights Watch, Israel's one has joined the ranks of countries like Egypt, Sudan, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela that have barred access to Human Rights Watch researchers. But our work continues. We've covered countries where we don't have regular access for our senior research staff on the ground. Of course, the difference here are many. One is we still have local colleagues on the ground in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, inside Israel, that continue to do field research for us. Of course, much of the research in this report, dates back to work that Human Rights Watch has done, over many years. We're still able to do interviews via, via video, via phone. We're still able to collect information, evidence in other ways. For this report, we also had other researchers come in to supplement the work that was done on the ground. So more generally, certainly, not having me, on the ground has an impact and has an effect, but we found other ways to compensate and continue to do the work, including using technology, having other colleagues help with on-the-ground research, our local team on the ground, working with partner organizations. So our work continues, just as it continues in those other countries in which our access on the ground is retained. I mean, we're not going to give any government a veto power over who does the work or over what issues we cover. Our work continues, and we'll continue to cover these same issues with the same methodology and with the same commitment to objective research that we have in the 100 countries across the world where we work in.
Yeah, I mean, you should bear in mind, you are amongst the illustrious group of people. The ICC wasn't allowed to enter into Israel as well, so they were boycotted. So I don't think you should feel bad about that. Next question, I was going to pack a few questions into one because we are running out of time. What has been the general response? I mean, Human Rights Watch isn't any human rights organization. It's probably the most pre-eminent human rights organization in the world. It cannot simply be ignored by governments, let alone a government which claims to be upholding human rights, like Joe Biden is. He's made human rights a #1 priority, as he said. So what has been the response there and elsewhere? Can you speak a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I think we've seen, we're not the first organization to make this determination. Obviously, Palestinians have been saying this for a while, Israeli groups in recent months. So I think the ground was really set. There have been also other developments. J Street, with their recent statement around U.S. aid and restrictions, and the Carnegie paper. So I think it's received a serious engagement. I think folks, obviously it's a 213-page report. Many want to review it with their legal departments, but we've had very serious questions and conversations and discussions, including with the Biden administration, around this report. Of course, the White House press secretary issued a statement, which was quite muted, but basically saying this isn't their assessment. But I think, for that to be the statement for Israel's closest ally, on a report that's this strong in its findings, the first time Human Rights Watch reaches a determination regarding crimes against humanity vis-a-vis Israeli conduct, I think is quite significant. This isn't something that's going to change overnight. But step one is to recognize reality for what it is. And I have to say, in dozens of meetings I've done, very few people come and disagree with that factual assessment. I think everybody sort of knows what the reality is we're dealing with on the ground. I think the myths, the fig leaves of peace process or temporary occupation or Israeli democracy or Palestinian self-rule, all of these have been sort of shown in recent years to be fig leaves. And so it's going to take time, obviously to move the conversation, but I've been very heartened to see serious engagement by a range of stakeholders, as well as, of course, there have been questions or comments about why are you doing this now, and what's the strategy here? And for us, it's quite simple, right? This is we applied a lot of the facts, and I think recent years have made clear that while there may have been, in years past, a sense that there could be a political solution around the corner, a temporary situation, recent years have made clear that the Israeli government intends to rule in perpetuity. They've said as much. Their facts on the ground have backed that up. The Jewish nation state law adds to that. So. We've been heartened to see that response, and we look forward to continuing to work to ensure that not only do more states recognize reality for what it is, you can't solve a problem you misdiagnose, but apartheid is the reality for millions of Palestinians, but also, that we end apartheid and persecution. That's the objective, and we're committed to working to end those crimes.
That's why it's one of the more puzzling criticism I read, even in the Harrods, for example. One of the columnists, he said, factually, the report cannot be faulted. Factually, everything's correct and true. But why now? Because Israel never concedes to pressure from outside pressure. So you have to kind of go along with Israel, find some kind of a resolution with Israel on your side. So I found that to be a really strange criticism of the report, but I think you've kind of mentioned your response to that.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of boils down to apartheid. So what?
Yeah, so what? That's right. Yeah.
Which is not the answer. I mean, these are crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity are among the most odious crimes under international law. They're called crimes against humanity because they affect all of us, regardless of your religion, ethnicity, nationality, whatever it is. So I think that response, I think doesn't understand the gravity of the situation. We're not talking about some abuses that are, a side note to a conflict. We're talking about really serious, severe, millions of people deprived of fundamental rights for decades solely because of who they are. That needs to end.
Mm-hmm. So before we end, just two more things I wanted to ask you. I mean, I know we're entering into the realm of political forecasting here, which isn't what you do. But I'm still interested to know what you have to say about this. Is part of your goal here just to, raise the bar and impose a political price on Israel, and also Europeans and Americans who are always willing to unconditionally support Israel, raise the political price for doing that? Is that part of the goal here?
No, look, our goal is to apply the law to the facts. And this was the determination we raised. So no matter what, wherever we make a determination, we publish it, irrespective of the political consequences. That said, to your question, we certainly believe there's a need to shift the paradigm here. We're not the only ones trying to do this, but this idea that a 54-year occupation is temporary, or that a 30-year peace process will on its own dismantle systemic oppression is just false. We at Human Rights Watch have documented crimes against humanity in many other parts of the world. We did a report, a week before the Israel-Palestine one on crimes against humanity against the Uyghurs in China. When you have crimes against humanity, you need to work on ending the human rights abuse. But for some reason, the world has the false assumption that human rights abuse is not the core issue here, that the core issue is the lack of negotiations. And that's wrong. So there is a need to reorient the situation to one of human rights abuse. And yes, there is a need to urgently change the status quo, right? This idea that the Biden administration can reverse the clock, 50% on what the Trump administration did, and suddenly we're going to have a better situation is false. And the sense of, with so much going on in the world wants to put this issue on the side. And I think this report, among others, are trying to say this is a alarm clock ringing here. This is an urgent situation. The world has an obligation, a duty to end crimes against humanity. And that's what needs to happen. So yes, part of this, the scenario is shifting the paradigm. Part of it is to push states to into action as opposed to inaction. But ultimately, this is really about us, making a determination that we felt the facts, warrant.
Let's end with some recommendations from your report. So what are the main recommendations that our viewers should go home with?
I would say we have 6 main recommendations to the international community in the report. Our recommendations to Israel are more or less end apartheid and persecution, spelled out in a couple of pages. To the international community, we have several main things. One is, issue statements recognizing the crime for what it is. Secondly, for the UN to establish a commission of inquiry to look into discrimination based on group identity across Israel and Palestine, as well as for the UN to appoint a global envoy for the crimes of apartheid and persecution. These have become forgotten crimes, but we documented them also with the treatment of Rohingya in Myanmar. There's a need for concerted global action to deal with them. Thirdly, we call for the ICC as well as national courts under the principle of universal jurisdiction to investigate and prosecute those implicated in the crime. Fourth, we call for targeted sanctions, including asset freezes and travel bans against those Israeli officials implicated in the crime. Fifth, to condition security and military assistance and arms sales to Israel on authorities ending these crimes. And sixth, for all states to evaluate all forms of bilateral agreements and engagement with Israel to ensure non-complicity in the crime, to mitigate human rights abuse where possible, and where not possible, to end those activities.
Omar, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Really appreciated your joining us here today. Thanks to our viewers at home as well. And you can download the report from Human Rights website or go to MEMO website. You can download the report from there as well. I hope to see you again soon, and our viewers at home, thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Nassim.